The muffled sound of a siren cut through the silence of the night like a knife through glass. On the deserted street, illuminated by the dim light of street lamps, the teenager with the backpack on his back quickened his steps, feeling the icy breath of disaster breathing down his back. Devin, a 15-year-old boy, had just returned home from a meeting with friends. His only mistake that night was being in a place where his skin color was like a target for hatred. The patrol car stopped abruptly, like a predator spotting its prey. The policeman, in uniform with a polished badge, got out with a slow, lazy step that betrayed his smugness. Jack Thorne, a cop with 10 years' experience and an endless sense of impunity, didn't even try to hide his contempt. "Hey, you," he growled, pointing the flashlight at Devin like a wanted suspect. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" "I'm just going home, sir," Devin replied, his voice shaking, but he tried to sound calm. "Home?" Thorne grinned, approaching slowly. "Home, then. What do you have in that backpack? Drugs, stolen goods, or maybe a gun?" Devin shook his head, clutching the straps of his backpack. "No, sir, there are only books in there. I'm in high school." "Books?" Thorne repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Are you trying to tell me that someone like you can read?" The phrase hit the boy like a whip. Thorne savored the moment, watching the humiliation and anger flash in his eyes. "Unzip the backpack," he commanded, and Devin complied. The cop snatched the backpack roughly, dumping its contents onto the sidewalk. Books, notebooks, and pencils scattered across the pavement like the wreckage of hope. Thorne snorted, kicking one of the books with the toe of his boot. "All clear. But, you know, kid, you don't really belong here. People like you should know your place." Devin clenched his fists but said nothing. He wanted to scream, but fear gripped every muscle in his body. Thorne saw that fear, and it only made him hotter. "You don't like it?" He stepped closer, grabbing the boy by the collar. "Then complain to someone." "Oh yeah, you can't, can you? Your word is nothing." One last push, and Devin fell to the pavement. Satisfied, Thorne spat beside him and walked back to the car. "And remember, pup," he tossed over his shoulder, "next time I won't be so kind." The headlights of the patrol car blinded the boy, leaving him sitting in the shadow of humiliation. He stood up, trying to gather his books, but tears glistened in his eyes. That night had changed everything. It shouldn't have been the beginning of tragedy, but it was when a spark was ignited that would soon explode Jack Thorne's life and make him feel the full weight of what he had done. The creak of doors greeted Devin as he entered his modest home, a small wooden cottage where everything was imbued with the warmth that only a mother's love could create. The whole world seemed hostile, but this place was his refuge. "Are you home, Day?" He heard a familiar voice. His mom looked out of the kitchen, her face tired but filled with concern. "Yeah," he answered quietly, trying to hide the worry in his voice. "It's all right?" He glanced toward the chair by the window. There, curled up in a cozy ball, slept Charlie, the fluffy gray cat who'd been by his side since he was a little boy. Charlie had always sensed when Devin was unwell, and now he stretched softly, purring as if to say, "I'm here." "Hey, buddy," Devin whispered, sitting down on the floor and hugging the cat. This was his best friend, the one who never betrayed or judged, but the night was just beginning to reveal its cruel cards. The next day, when the sun had not yet risen above the horizon, there was a rough knock on the door. Devin jumped up from his bed when he heard his mother open it. A familiar voice, soaked with venom, broke through the thin walls. Do you have a permit to keep animals?" It was Thorne. His tone was as cold as it had been that night. Devin froze, feeling his heart slowing and speeding up at the same time. He hurried to the door, but his mother was already carrying on a tense conversation. "It's our house cat," she said demurely, but there was a tinge of steel in her voice. "He's not bothering anyone." Thorne grinned, his smile full of derision. "It may be a house cat to you, but to us it's a disturbance. Here in our neighborhood we try to keep it clean." "It's just an animal," Devin interjected, stepping out from behind his mother. His voice shook, but his eyes burned with anger. He hadn't done anything wrong. "Oh, really?" Thorne stepped closer, looking intently at the boy. "You think you can tell me how to enforce the law?" Devin fell silent, feeling the weight of that stare. Thorne backed away slowly, but before he left he tossed a glance over his shoulder. "Make sure that animal is no longer here. Otherwise, I'll take care of it myself." Night shrouded the city again when Devin returned home. He felt uneasy, like something terrible was about to happen. Charlie was sitting by the window as always, his big amber eyes staring out at the street where the sparse street lights flickered. But when there was the crunch of gravel under the wheels of the patrol car, Devin's heart twitched. Thorne stepped out of the car with a flashlight in his hand. He took his time, his steps slow and menacing. Devin rushed to the door, but it was too late. A rumbling sound echoed through the yard. Charlie, sensing the threat, leaped out the open window. Thorne followed like a predator. "No! Charlie!" Devin shouted, running outside. But Thorne did not stop. He caught up to the animal at the fence, grabbed it by the scruff of the neck and lifted it off the ground with a savage grin. "Get your hands off him," Devin begged, tears of despair rolling down his cheeks. "That filthy animal has no place in our neighborhood," Thorne said coldly. He threw the cat to the ground in one swift motion. Devin's scream merged with the dead silence of the night as he ran toward Charlie's still body. Everything inside him was screaming, tearing at him, but there was nothing he could do. Thorne whistled a tune and walked back to his car, leaving the boy alone with the pain. That was the final blow. The warm shelter that Charlie had been to him had collapsed. Devin sat on the floor that night, holding his dead friend tightly in his arms. The anger inside of him flared, becoming a fire that would one day burn everything Thorne thought he owned. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from. Has something similar happened in your life? Share your experiences and thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of this story and other equally exciting stories. And now we continue. The house was filled with a silence that was like a thick fog. In the corner of the room, by the window, Devin sat with his hands on his knees. His eyes were red with tears and his chest burned empty, as if someone had ripped out the last thing that kept him safe. Charlie was gone, and that fact was killing every second of it. The mother stood nearby, her face impassive. She did not shout, did not ask questions, did not try to calm her son. She seemed to be thinking about something, her eyes fixed on the darkness outside the window. "Do you know who did it?" she finally asked. Her voice was low, quiet, but it made the boy wince. There was a cold, almost frightening certainty in it. "It was him. That cop," Devin whispered without raising his head. Her mother clenched her hands into fists, and for a moment the room felt even colder. The air seemed to thicken around her, as if her rage itself had weight. But instead of bursting into anger, she simply sighed and said, "Devin, go to bed. Tomorrow's another day." Her son raised his eyes to her, full of pain and incomprehension. How could she remain so calm after everything? He wanted to scream, to demand action, but something in her gaze kept him silent. As the house fell into darkness, Devon's mother sat at the table in the kitchen. An old, shabby book lay before her, its pages scrawled with strange symbols. Her fingers glided over them as if they were long-forgotten friends. On the wall hung a photograph, a young woman smiling next to a man in military uniform. She looked at the picture, her face darkened with an expression of grief mixed with hatred. "You were right, James," she whispered, as if addressing an image. "This world will never change." She stood up, pulled out the bottom drawer of the closet, and pulled out an old, locked box. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside were papers, photographs, and among them a tarnished silver locket. She took it in her hands, squeezed it so hard her knuckles turned white. The memories came over her with inexorable force. Screaming crowds, burning crosses, shot-up houses. She saw them over and over again, the faces of the people she had managed to save and those she had lost. She knew that she could not sit idly by any longer. The next morning, Devon noticed that something had changed in his mother. Her movements were more confident, her eyes glittering with a cold gleam. He couldn't quite put his finger on what was different, but he sensed something was brewing. "You have to stay home today," she said over breakfast, leaving no room for argument. "But the school," Devon began. "I said stay home." She cut him off, giving him a look that sent a chill down his spine. She left the house a few minutes later, leaving her son completely confused. Mother headed toward the center of town, where the station where Thorne served was located. She didn't walk. Her steps were predatory, full of purpose. The people on the street gave way involuntarily, not understanding why they felt such inexplicable fear from her. When she stopped at the door of the station, her gaze slid over the nameplate with the officers' names on it. When she found the right one, she grinned softly. "Jack Thorne," she said, as if tasting his name. She turned and walked away, but there was a fire in her eyes that could no longer be extinguished. That night, Devon heard her whisper something in the silence of her room. Her voice was low, the words incomprehensible, but they made him feel cold. He pressed himself against the wall, listening, but he didn't dare enter. When he found the locket his mother had always kept in the corner of the kitchen, he realized that something dark and irreversible had already begun. There was silence in the small house, but it was deceptive. Every object, every shadow, seemed to hide secrets that Devon had never noticed before. His mother remained calm, but her movements were cautious, like someone preparing for something inevitable. The next morning, when she left the house, Devon was alone. He felt like she was taking all his defenses with her, leaving him among the walls that now seemed cold. He decided to look for answers. Opening the cabinets, he found the same old box she had pulled out the night before. His heart sank when he saw the pictures, the letters, and the locket. He picked it up, feeling the coldness of the metal, and suddenly images flashed before his eyes, strange and frightening. He saw his mother, but not as he knew her. She was younger, with long hair braided into a tight braid, surrounded by people who looked frightened but respectful. In one of the pictures, her eyes glowed with determination, a burning torch in her hand. Devon couldn't figure out what it meant, but a chill ran down his skin. His mother returned late in the evening, and Devon couldn't stand it. "Who are you?" he blurted out, holding up a photograph. She stopped in the doorway, her face frozen. She walked slowly to the table and sat down across from him. "You found something you weren't supposed to see," she said, her voice quiet but frighteningly calm. "I have a right to know," Devon insisted, trying not to avert his gaze, even though everything inside was trembling. She lowered her gaze to the photograph, ran her finger along its edge as if going back in time. "My name was Layla Johnson," she began. "I was once a woman who believed in justice. I fought for the rights of those no one wanted to protect." She recounted how, in her youth, the city was plagued by fear. Hate groups fomenting violence intimidated families, destroyed homes. Layla led the resistance. She gathered around her similarly desperate people who decided they would no longer be silent. But their victory came at a high price. Those in power couldn't forgive her for defying the system. One night, as her husband and Devon's father, James, defended their home, a mob came with fire and guns. James died and Layla disappeared with her son. "It wasn't over," she continued, her eyes sparkling. "I did everything I could to hide and protect you, but I lost faith in the world." "What are these strange things?" Devon asked, pointing to the symbols in the book and the locket. Her gaze turned cold. "It's what allows me to fight when there's nothing else to do. My power is what I got by paying too high a price. People called me a witch, a sorceress, because I was able to find their weaknesses, to make them feel what they caused others to feel." "Is it true? Are you a witch?" Devon felt a chill run down his spine. She was silent for a moment, then answered, "If being a witch means protecting your own when no one else can, then yes." That night, Devon couldn't sleep. His head spun with discovery and his heart clenched with pain. He looked at his mother with different eyes. She was no longer just a strict and caring woman. She was something more, something dark yet fiercely protective of him. His mother, sitting at the table, was leafing through a book, her lips whispering words he didn't understand. The air around her seemed dense, vibrating. She knew that soon she would have to use everything she knew how to do. The next morning, as she left, she said only one thing to him. "There's a time coming when you'll have to see things you won't understand. Just trust me." And, though he wanted to believe her, fear and misunderstanding were growing inside. He felt the shadows of the past beginning to envelop his life as well, and something terrible lay ahead that would change their world forever. Her mother stood in the dimly lit kitchen, her hands resting on the old wooden table. On its surface lay a newspaper clipping with a picture of Officer Jack Thorne. Her eyes were like frozen ice flakes, and her mouth was tightly clenched. That photograph was the last link in the chain. She was slowly but surely tightening around her victim. Devon watched her silently from the doorway. He saw her body tense, her breathing deep and measured. She didn't scream, didn't show any signs of overt anger, but there was an energy in the room that made the hairs on his arms stand up. "Mom?" he cautiously called out. She raised her head slowly, her gaze directed somewhere through him, as if she saw something more than he could see. "You weren't supposed to see that," she said without raising her voice, but her words sounded like a sentence. "Do you want to do something to him?" Devon took a step forward, afraid to hear the answer, but even more afraid of the silence. She looked up at him. For the first time in a long time, her eyes showed more than cold determination. There was anger there, hatred, but also a pinch of bitterness. This man, he made a choice for which he will have to pay. Devon felt a shiver run through his body. But how? What are you going to do? The mother straightened slowly, her hands clenched into fists. Sometimes justice doesn't come by itself, she said. It has to be summoned. Later that night, Layla sat in her room. On the floor in front of her was a charcoal circle with a medallion in its center. The windows were closed tightly, and the only light was from the candles, whose flames danced as if in obedience to her breath. Devin peered through the ajar door, and his heart clenched. He thought the air in the room felt dense, taut, as if space had begun to thicken around him. "Mom, what are you doing?" His voice sounded louder than he expected. She didn't raise her head, but her voice cut through the silence. "Something I should have done years ago." "Is it dangerous?" he asked, nervously rubbing the sleeve of his t-shirt. She cast a glance at him over her shoulder. "The danger is letting people like him get on with their business." The next day, Layla went into town. Her gait was confident and her gaze was cold. She went to the library, to the archives, to places where she could find information about Thorne. She learned about his past, the complaints that had always been hushed up, the dozens of families left unanswered, his connections that helped him remain untouchable. Back home, she began to write. Lists of names, dates, details of his crimes. It all came together into one picture. "What's that?" Devin asked, standing behind her back. "A map of his dirty deeds," she replied. "He left too many traces. People think they can hide from what they've done, but the truth will always find a way out." "And what are you going to do about it?" Devin felt his voice shake. She turned to him, her face grim but full of strength. "I will make him feel every pain he has caused others." Later that night, Devin heard strange noises, a whisper like the wind, but coming from inside the house. He peeked into her room and saw his mother sitting in front of an unfolded book. Her lips were moving, but the words were incomprehensible to him. "Mom, stop it. It scares me," he said quietly. She looked up and a soft smile appeared on her face. "Don't be afraid, Devin. It's necessary." "But what if it ruins you?" His voice trembled. "If it will rid the world of the likes of Thorne, it will be worth it," she replied, her voice soft, but there was steel in it. Devin knew he could no longer stop her. He could only watch as his mother, his silent and frightening protector, turned into a force that could destroy. Each day, the mosaic of revenge became clearer and clearer. Layla recognized Thorne's weaknesses, his fears, his attachments. She saw how every action she took pushed him to the edge. It was no longer just a plan. It had become an inevitability. Jack Thorne sat at his desk in the station, sipping cheap coffee from a paper cup. It had been a quiet day, not counting the complaints which he ignored as usual. It was routine for him, to humiliate, to control, to feel his power. People like him saw no evil in his actions. For him, it was a game he always won. "Thorne, did you see the complaint against you yesterday?" the junior officer asked, casting a concerned look at him. Jack only grinned, leaning back in his chair. "Another one? How many are there now? 10? 20? Let them write as many as they want, Jenkins. You know I won't get anything for it." He laughed, and his loud, smug laughter echoed around the room. But that same evening, driving home, Thorne felt a strange uneasiness. Usually, he drove down familiar streets without the slightest hesitation. But tonight, something was wrong. The lights of the street lamps seemed dim, and the shadows seemed longer than usual. At one of the intersections, he noticed a figure standing motionless by the curb. It was a skinny teenager, staring straight at him. The boy's eyes were blank, but something inhuman flickered in them. Thorne blinked, and the boy disappeared. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, waving away the feeling that something was going wrong. "This is bullshit," he muttered to himself. But the anxiety was growing. The next day at the station, Thorne found an envelope on his desk. Inside was a photograph. It was a photograph, taken years ago, of him next to a woman crying. He immediately remembered that day. The raid, the arrest, his jokes that he thought were funny. "Who brought this?" he asked loudly, but no one answered. His colleagues shrugged. On the back of the photo was written, "It's all coming back." His heart beat faster. "Damn joke," he muttered, tossing the photo into the trash can. But as he tried to continue his work, his thoughts kept returning to that woman. Her face, her tears. For some reason, that now disturbed him. That night, Thorne sat in his house, nervously changing channels on the television. He tried to forget about the strange little things that had haunted him all day. But the sounds started coming from nowhere. Rustles, creaks, and then a light knock, like someone scrabbling at the door. "Who's there?" he shouted, grabbing the gun from the table. He opened the door, but there was no one on the porch. Only the wind moved the old newspaper on the floor. But when he went back inside, he noticed that on his desk was the same picture he had thrown away that morning. This time, it said on the back, "You remembered, but they didn't forget." His heart sank. Each day, the weirdness increased. His car wouldn't start for no apparent reason. Doors creaked, windows slammed shut, even though there was no wind. On one of his shifts, he saw a silhouette on a street corner, but when he got closer, there was no one there. "Something wrong with you, Thorne?" his colleague asked, noticing his nervousness. "It's all right," he snarled. But he knew he wasn't. Something was getting closer. Something was following him. At night, he could not sleep. Every rustle and crackle seemed to intensify in the silence. His dreams became nightmares. The faces of the people he had humiliated rose before him, their eyes burning with hatred. He woke up in a cold sweat and saw that the door to his bedroom was ajar. There was a locket on the floor by the threshold. Thorne bent to pick it up, but his fingers froze. The locket was cold, and as he looked at it, his mind was filled with flashes of images. A woman with burning eyes, a boy with a blank stare, and himself kneeling. He recoiled, dropping the medallion to the floor. His breathing quickened. "Who are you?" he shouted into the void. But there was no answer. Only silence, heavy and pressing, like a premonition of impending disaster. Thorne was beginning to lose control. His illusion of invincibility was crumbling with each passing day. Fear boiled inside him that he had never felt before. Everything he'd thought of as his strength now seemed fragile and unreliable. And somewhere in the silence of the night, Layla's voice sounded like a whisper of wind. "You will learn what it means to be afraid." Let's pause for one more brief moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from. Has there been something similar in your life? Share your impressions and thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of this and other exciting stories. And now we continue. Jack Thorne always considered himself untouchable. His star on his uniform was a symbol of power, not justice. In his world, it was simple. Those who were weaker deserved neither respect nor protection. But in recent days, something was changing, and that something was causing his slow but inexorable decline. Monday began as usual. Thorne arrived at the station, threw his jacket on the back of a chair, and sat down at his desk. But instead of the usual conversations with his co-workers, he noticed that tension hung around him. People were looking at him strangely, as if they knew something but wouldn't say it. "What kind of faces?" he threw, trying to sound confident. No one answered. Finally, Jenkins, the youngest on their team, looked up. "We've heard one thing," he began cautiously. "Did you hear that?" Thorne stepped forward. "About you," Jenkins blurted out. "About you overreacting to a boy on the street a couple days ago." Thorne's heart skipped a beat. "So, what? Is this another complaint?" He tried to laugh, but his voice gave away his tension. "Maybe a complaint," said one of my colleagues, "but it wouldn't be the first time. You know, Thorne, people in town are starting to talk." His fingers clenched into a fist. "Let them talk. As long as I'm here, I'm doing my job," he replied coldly. But deep down, Thorne knew the situation was getting out of hand. The next day, the review board came to the station. They sat in the conference room, flipping through Thorne's case files. Complaints, reports, unproven accusations, they all came to the surface. "Why now?" he asked when he was summoned to the chief's office. "Because too much has begun to surface, Thorne," the captain replied, giving him a scrutinizing look. "We can't ignore it any longer." The words cut him like a knife. But he knew that none of his colleagues, who had stood up for him before, would stand up for him now. Meanwhile, strange things began to happen in the city. People who were once afraid to even mention his name began to speak louder. A woman he humiliated years ago came forward to the local media with a story about her trauma. A young guy, accused by him without evidence, recorded a video detailing his story. These stories began to gain popularity. Hashtags calling for justice appeared on social media. The names of Thorne's victims became known, and their stories spread like wildfire. "Did you see this?" Jenkins asked, showing his colleagues the phone. Thorne tried to wave it away. "It's nothing. People love to complain." But now his words sounded uncertain even to himself. One night, Thorne decided to take his mind off things by going to a bar. He was sitting at the bar, staring into a glass of whiskey, when he heard a conversation behind him. "That cop, Thorne," somebody was talking. "Heard he was messing with somebody again. He's been like that his whole life." "I'm surprised he hasn't been fired yet," another voice replied. "Or maybe he'll be fired soon. I hear one of his victims is building a case." Thorne turned around abruptly. "What did you say in there?" His voice was low, threatening. The man turned around, not immediately recognizing Thorne, but when he saw his face, he frowned. "I said, everyone knows what a scumbag you are." Thorne clenched his fists but didn't get into a fight. Instead, he walked out of the bar, feeling every glance escorting him with disdain. At home, he tried to sleep, but nightmares haunted him. The faces of those he had humiliated rose before him. Their eyes burned with anger, and their voices echoed in his head. "You ruined my life. You thought you'd never have to answer for it. It's all coming back." He awoke in a cold sweat, breathing heavily. In the corner of the bedroom, in the shadows, a figure appeared to him. "Who's there?" he shouted, grabbing the gun. Silence. Only his own breathing and the beating of his heart. The next morning at the station, he felt his loneliness become apparent. No one laughed at his jokes anymore. No one sat with him at the dinner table. Everyone looked at him as if he were a man who was about to fall. "They'll dig, Thorne," the captain said, calling him out. "And if they find anything, they'll write you off like old trash." "It's all lies," he muttered, clenching his teeth. But inside he knew. His power was an illusion, and now it was crumbling like a house of cards. And somewhere outside the lot, In the shadows, Layla was watching him. She knew his fall was near. Her work was almost done. Night fell like a heavy blanket over the city, and with it came a silence that promised nothing good. Jack Thorne sat in his house, staring at the bottle of whiskey he had half emptied. His life was slowly but inexorably disintegrating. Complaints, investigations, alienated co-workers, all of it was tightening the noose around his neck. But what troubled him most of all were the strange occurrences that had begun to happen around him. He drank to dull the anxiety, but alcohol no longer helped. At dawn, Thorne awoke to a pounding. Muffled thumps sounded from outside, somewhere near the door. He grabbed the gun he always kept on his bedside table and walked cautiously to the front door. "Who's there?" he shouted. There was no response. He opened the door, but there was no one behind it. Only a small ball of cloth lay in the dirt by the threshold. Thorne bent down and picked it up. It was an old children's shirt. The fabric was torn, dirty, and the name Devon was embroidered in black thread on the pocket. Thorne tossed the shirt as if it were poisoned and closed the door abruptly. Things got worse at the station. His reputation was plummeting. Colleagues who had once supported him now shunned him, not wanting to be dragged into the growing scandal. "Did you hear what he did to that boy?" They were whispering behind his back. "They say his mother has already contacted lawyers." These conversations didn't stop, and Thorne couldn't drown them out. He could feel the walls around him shrinking, but the worst part was that he began to see things. One night, he was patrolling the streets when he saw a woman at the far end of an alley. She stood motionless, her silhouette standing out against the dim light of a street lamp. "Hey!" shouted Thorne, getting out of the car. She didn't move. He headed toward her, his hand already reaching for his gun. "You're breaking the law. Get out of here." But as he came closer, she lifted her head, and the light illuminated her face. It was a woman from his past, one of those he'd humiliated years ago. Her eyes were blank, but her mouth was moving, saying something soundless. Thorne stepped back, his breathing quickening. When he blinked, she was gone. "What the hell?" he muttered, walking back to the car. The next day, there was another gift in his locker at the station, a photograph of the very woman he had seen the night before. On the back was written, "You can't hide." Thorne tried to find out who planted it, but the cameras at the station didn't pick up anything. "It's one of you," he shouted to his colleagues, but they only remained silent, exchanging worried glances. His fear was beginning to turn into paranoia. Layla watched from the shadows as he slowly lost control. She took her time. Every step of her plan was calibrated, every detail aimed at destroying his mind before she struck the final blow. She didn't just want him to answer for his crimes, she wanted him to feel everything his victims felt. By evening, Thorne was back home again. His house, which had once been his fortress, now seemed alien to him. The curtains moved, though the windows were closed. The floorboards creaked as if someone had walked on them. He locked the doors, checked the windows, and sat in the chair with the gun in his lap. But the silence did not bring peace. The whispers filled his house again, growing louder and louder. He looked around, but saw no one. "Get out!" he shouted. The whispers turned into loud voices, each accusing him. "You ruined my life. You thought you'd never answer. It's all coming back." Thorne jumped up, waving his gun. "Who are you? Where are you?" But instead of an answer, he saw himself in the mirror opposite, but not as he was now. His reflection was stained with blood. He ran out of the house into the night darkness, breathing heavily. Layla knew he was close to breaking. She saw it in his movements, in the way his eyes no longer glittered with self-confidence. She knew his world was crumbling, and now he was the one feeling the fear himself. But there was more pain ahead, and she prepared to deliver the final, crushing blow. Jack Thorne woke up on the cold floor of his house. The last few days had been an endless nightmare, where reality and hallucination blended into one. He didn't even remember how he'd gotten here. The room was dark, with only a thin strip of light coming through the closed curtains. All he had left was the gun in his hand and a dying sense of control. His cell phone lay on the table, its screen flickering. Thorne picked it up with trembling hands to check the time, but saw a strange message instead of the familiar screen. "Your payback is near. Get out of the house if you're ready to face the truth." He rushed to the door, checking the locks. No one could have gotten in, he was sure of it, but the message was here, and it was real. "Who are you?" He shouted into the void, but again there was only silence. After a few minutes he did come out. His breath caught in the cold night air, and his heart beat so loudly that he thought he could hear it in his ears. The house was surrounded by darkness, but in the distance, by the old factory, he spotted a light. It was an invitation, or a trap. But Thorne knew he had no choice. The factory had been abandoned for years. The metal walls were rusting, the roof collapsed in several places. The light came from the center of the large workshop, where a lone chair stood and a locket he'd seen before lay beside it. He approached, holding his gun at the ready. "Come out. I know you're in here," he shouted. "You don't need to yell, Thorne," came a voice, calm and icy. Layla stepped from the shadows, her figure clearly outlined in the light of the lamp. She didn't look frightened. On the contrary, her calmness was intimidating. "Was it you? Did you do all this?" Thorne's voice trailed off into a scream. "Yes," she answered briefly, her gaze never leaving his. He raised his gun, aiming it directly at her. "Don't come any closer." She grinned, but didn't stop. "You think a gun will give you power? You forget, Thorne, that power is just an illusion." His fingers squeezed the trigger, but before he could fire, the lamps around him began to flicker, and the air in the room grew thick, as if the factory itself had come to life. Thorne felt his body stiffen with fear. "What are you doing?" he shouted, stepping back. Layla stepped closer, her eyes seeming to burn. "It's not me. It's you. Your deeds, your sins, your sacrifices, they all came after you." The floor shook suddenly, and Thorne fell to his knees. Figures began to appear around him, blurred and unreal, but each one was painfully familiar. They were people he'd humiliated, beaten, whose lives he'd ruined. You're not real," he shouted, but the figures were getting closer, their voices merging into a chorus of accusations. "You took my son away from me. You destroyed my family. You thought you could do whatever you wanted." Thorne closed his eyes, but they kept coming. "Layla, stop it," he shouted. She leaned toward him, her face impassive. "You wanted to be feared. Now you know what it means to be afraid." He opened his eyes to see shadows encircling him on all sides. Every face, every accusation crashed into his mind, shattering the last vestiges of his confidence. I can fix this," he screamed. "No," Layla replied coldly. "You can't fix anything anymore." As if at her command, the shadows closed around him. He screamed, but his voice faded into the night. In the morning, Thorne was found in an abandoned factory. He was alive, but completely broken. His eyes were empty, and his face was pale. He was sitting on the floor, clutching the locket in his hands. It was the beginning of his end. The scandals, the evidence that surfaced after this incident ruined his career. No one feared him anymore, and his life became a miserable existence. Layla never appeared by his side again. She knew her work was done. Thorne had experienced everything he'd inflicted on others, and this was his punishment. She returned home where her son was waiting for her with questions. "What did you do to him?" he asked. She looked up at him, her face tired but calm. "I did what I had to do. Justice isn't always the law. Sometimes you have to create it." And a spark of strength lit up in her eyes, which now finally found peace at last. The factory was left behind, its rusted walls no longer holding sinister secrets. Jack Thorne was broken. He was no longer the threat, no longer the omnipotent cop he once thought he was. Layla had completed her mission, but her heart was still heavy. The price of justice is always high, and she knew her actions wouldn't change the world, but they had given her son and the man's other victims a chance at a new life. The next morning, the newspapers were full of headlines. Police scandal, Officer Thorne accused of dozens of violations. Stories of his victims circulated online, and photos of a broken man, once feared, now became a symbol of the fall of an unjust government. But this wasn't just a revenge story. It was a lesson. Devin sat on the porch of his house, holding the locket in his hands. He stared at it for a long time, feeling its cold metal and remembering what his mother had said. This medallion symbolizes strength, but it is also a reminder of the pain that led to it. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Layla came out of the house and sat down beside him. She looked tired, but her eyes no longer held the darkness that had accompanied her the last few days. "Did you make it?" he finally asked. She nodded. "Yes, but it won't bring back what we've lost." "Then why?" His voice was quiet, but there was pain in it. Layla looked up at him and her gaze softened. "Not for revenge, for the truth. To show the world that even those who think they're above the law can't hide." Devin nodded, but he had a hard time accepting it. Weeks passed. The case against Thorne gained strength. His former colleagues would not defend him, too afraid of losing their own positions. People who had once thought him invulnerable were now relieved to see him fall. But Layla knew this wasn't the end. The world is full of people like Thorne. Every day brought new challenges, new tragedies. She began to help others, people who had experienced injustice. Her name became known among those who sought protection. But she no longer used the power that had helped her destroy Thorne. She knew that this dark side could easily consume her if she allowed herself to depend on it. Layla and Devin were sitting down to dinner one evening. For the first time in a long time, the house was quiet. "Are you not afraid anymore?" he asked. She hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Fear will always be there, but fear is a reminder that we are alive." "What about me? How am I supposed to go on living?" Devin lowered his eyes, remembering those nights when he'd felt helpless. "You have to remember that you are stronger than you think," Layla replied. "We all go through moments that break us, but the strength is in getting up again and again." Those words became important to him. He no longer felt like a victim. He saw in front of him a man who had fought for justice despite all the difficulties. Layla's last visit was to the old factory. She stood in silence, looking at the collapsed walls where Jack Thorne's trial had taken place. She pulled the locket out of her pocket and tossed it into the pile of debris. "This place doesn't need to be remembered anymore," she said to herself. As she left, she felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. Devin started walking to school with his head held high. He was no longer afraid to face people who might look down on him. His tragedy and how he dealt with it was a lesson to him. Layla and Devin's story became more than revenge. It was a reminder to everyone that evil, no matter how powerful it may seem, will always find an end. Justice, however slowly, will always find a way. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced racism or injustice in your life? Your opinion is very important to us, and we value each and every one of you. Subscribe to our channel and give us a like if you like this story. We wish you a good day and remind you that every voice counts and justice will always find a way.